Well, this just seems like way too serious a group today. I'm out.
Hi, Sean.
Hello.
Oh, he's out.
We're all a lively bunch.
Right, is Dan joining? Oh, there he is. He just popped up.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry that it's taken me a minute. I'm just trying to get connected.
No worries. All right, Mayor and Kim, I think we've got everybody and we're recording and live streaming.
All right, it's 6 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started with tonight's council meeting. It is Tuesday, October 5th, 2021. We are holding a workshop for the Lake Stevens City Council. We're doing it via Zoom. There is no public comment tonight, so we can just go ahead and get started into the presentation. We have a joint workshop with Lake Stevens Sewer District, Department of Ecology, draft Puget Sound nutrient general permit. We have several people that have joined us from different organizations. Welcome everybody to Lake Stevens tonight, and we really appreciate you coming in and sharing information with us. So who is going to start this
Well, good evening, Council Member Daughtry. This is Commissioner Lawrence of Lake Stevens Sewer District. I'd like to go ahead and open it at least for the Board of Commissioners for Lake Stevens Sewer District, indicating it is 6 p.m. on October 5th, 2021. It is a joint meeting we are having with the City Council of Lake Stevens. And I just want to introduce, I know we have Commissioner Koshi and Commissioners Stevenson in attendance this evening, and we do have some presenters with the staff that have been asked to kind of give both the City Council and the Board of Commissioners update on some of the Department of Ecology nutrients issues coming down the pipeline per se. So with that, I'll turn that over to the City Council as I work on getting my video to function properly.
Okay, so welcome everybody again. Are we just going to go to the Department of Ecology for the draft plan? Who's going to lead us off here? Crickets. Okay.
Commissioner Daughtry, the first presenter is going to be Jeff Clark with the WASWD, Washington Association of Water and Sewer Districts.
Okay, Mr. Clark, thank you. You're on.
Turn it over.
Thanks, Mariah.
Sure. Jeff, my name is Jeff Clark. I'm a representative that, as she said, of the Washington State Association of Sewer and Water Districts. I'm also a commissioner with the Mukilteo Water and Wastewater District. And previously I was the general manager at the Alderwood District. I was asked to serve as the WASWD representative on an advisory committee that the Department of Ecology put together to work on a general permit for treatment plants that send effluent into Puget Sound. Just a little background, you probably know some of this already, but the Department of Ecology believes that there is a dissolved oxygen problem in Puget Sound. They believe that there's too many nutrients, primarily nitrogen, entering Puget Sound, and that this is causing additional plant growth, algal growth, and through the life cycle of those plants, they eat up oxygen. And they believe that the end result of this is affecting the salmon and affecting orca. Their solution is to place restrictions on treatment plants around the sound in order to try to reduce the amount of nutrients going into the sound, and they believe that this will solve the problem that they've identified. There's a lot of controversy about that with the treatment plants. We're talking about 58 wastewater treatment plants around the sound. These range from some plants up in Whatcom County all the way down to Olympia. It's only the plants that are sending effluent directly into Puget Sound. There are a handful of plants that send it into rivers that feed into the sound for reasons that I still don't totally understand. Ecology left those off the table at this time. We were called together. They formed an advisory committee back in spring of last year, 2020. They had made an announcement a couple of months before that they were going to create a general permit to cover all 58 plants that are involved here. All of these plants already have individual permits, NPDES permits. These permits were issued by the Department of Ecology and have been enforced by Ecology, and some go back 30 to 40 years and have been updated over time. However, they believe that they need an overall general permit to cover all of these plants. This will not replace the individual permits. It will be in addition to those individual permits. And it will give some sort of consistency to monitoring and operations and control the effluent going into Puget Sound. That's the goal of Ecology. We started meeting just at the same time the pandemic really hit big time. I have never met face-to-face with about 3/4 of the people on the advisory committee. There were representatives of environmental groups, state agencies, federal agencies, and a number of utilities. Some of the utilities that were represented were King County, the city of Tacoma, Pierce County, and city of Everett. Many of those folks had significant staff behind them, many of whom have as much or more technical expertise on this issue as the Department of Ecology. So we met virtually for the next 6 months. The utilities complained from the start that this was no way to, if you'll pardon the expression, run a railroad, that we needed to meet in person, and that many of us had significantly increased workloads because of the COVID problem. Ecology from the start has been very clear that they had a timeline they were trying to meet, and they were not going to let anything slow them down. And the whole process has very clearly been driven to a desired end, which is a general permit that would essentially freeze nutrient levels going into Puget Sound. So it became very contentious very quickly. Some of the things that the draft general permit that came out in the fall, I believe in August, would require most plants to increase the amount of monitoring they do of their plants, and it would also put caps on how many nutrients can be sent out to the Puget Sound for each plant. So each plant has its own levels based on where they are right now, but it comes very close to freezing them in place. One of the objections we raised was that a plant such as the Alderwood plant was built with a maximum capacity of 6 million gallons a day. However, it's operating at about 2.5 million gallons a day. And that was not a mistake. The engineers wanted to build it so that it had room for growth because, as you may well guess, in Southwest Snohomish County, there's a ton of growth coming to that district. However, that means a cap on it means that Alderwood either has to significantly change their operations to reduce the amount of nutrients going into the sound, or they need to stop accepting connections to their facilities, or they need to expand and modify their treatment plant at significant expense. And this is not a 1945 treatment plant. This was opened in 2012. It was a rebuild of the previous plant. And it was rebuilt under the guidance of the Department of Ecology, which said at that time, you're going to meet all of our standards, so this is just fine. And now suddenly 10 years later, they're saying it's badly outdated and needs to be upgraded to reduce nutrients. Nutrients are not a new issue. They've been talked about for at least 20 years in this region, and yet Ecology has continued to go ahead and approve plant designs and operations with the current types of nutrients, and never a problem. Now there's a problem. So why is that? The reason appears to be that the Northwest Environmental Advocates, a private environmental group out of Portland, filed lawsuits against the Department of Ecology, saying that they are not enforcing state and federal laws on water quality. And Ecology since then has been scrambling to try to not be sued and not wind up in court. They've never said that, but it's become very obvious. And so they do not want to slow down. They don't want to listen to reason, and they continue to push for a general permit that would be very restrictive. The city of Tacoma has done a rough estimate of what it would take to come into compliance with the draft permit. Their estimate is $1 billion for their own facilities. King County has done some estimates, and they figure that they would be spending more than $10 billion to upgrade their facilities. Now, King County is a wholesale sewer operator. They don't connect to anybody's house directly. There are numerous cities and districts that collect the waste and then send it on to King County's three major treatment plants for treatment. King County currently charges about $45 a month for every home that connects to them. So that's $45 a month. Their estimate is that 10 years from now, if they have to follow these rules, that bill would be $250. So it would be 5 times as high. Now there's attorneys and engineers that won't even notice the difference, but there's a lot of people who are getting by on low wages in the Seattle King County area who would be significantly impacted by a quintupling of their sewer fee from King County. So there's a lot of concerns about that expense, but the major concern is that many of the districts do not believe that the Department of Ecology has made its case. Ecology refused to talk about the science. They say the science is proven. There are many people who are experts on Puget Sound who say the science is not proven and it does not support what the Department of Ecology believes. And yet Ecology is pushing forward and wants us to spend billions of dollars to fix a problem that they have not, first of all, that they have not proven it's a problem. And second, they have not shown for sure that changing the treatment plants like this would actually solve the problem. And one of the most disturbing things is that if you look at where there's dissolved oxygen problems around the sound, it's in narrow, shallow embayments. If you look down at South Sound, where there's these fingers of bays sticking into the land, that's where the dissolved oxygen problem is. Throughout most of Puget Sound, there is no dissolved oxygen problem. And yet Ecology continues to push forward on change and requiring all 58 plants to make changes. I would also note that 2 plants, the Renton plant and the West Point plant, both operated by King County, those 2 plants together constitute 50% of the nutrients entering Puget Sound from treatment plants. So we have talked to them repeatedly about, do the really small plants that have essentially no impact, do they need, oh yes, they need to be upgraded and changed. The other point we make consistently, and which they want to ignore, is that Mother Nature is the biggest problem. More than half of the nutrients entering Puget Sound come from the Pacific Ocean. Another significant portion comes from surface water runoff. But Ecology has no control over Mother Nature, and it has very little control over surface water runoff. What they do have control over is your treatment plant and our treatment plant. And that's where they want to try to show the environmental group that they're trying to save the sound. I want to save the sound, and all the utilities do. That's the business we're in, clean water. And yet there's a very strong belief by the utilities that this is going to be tremendous expenditure, and there's no proof that it's going to solve the problem. I could go on, but I won't. And if I'm not the person to give you a lot of technical background information about the biology or chemistry of Puget Sound, but I have been through this process. I've been very disappointed by the advisory committee process because of Ecology's refusal to really slow down and do the job right. Any questions?
Quick question, Jeff. Thank you for your presentation. Just right at your beginning of your presentation, you indicated that this doesn't apply to facilities just charging to rivers leading to Puget Sound. And I guess in the case of the Lake Stevens Sewer District, does this even apply? And then secondly, doesn't all water end up in Puget Sound?
The answer to well, yes, to the second question, all water in the watershed goes down to Puget Sound. And to answer the first question is it apparently does apply to Lake Stevens, because this rule about rivers, it's not clear where they draw the dividing line. There are plants that are farther upstream on some rivers that are left out of this process, and some plants, a small number of plants that discharge into a river that is fairly close to the sound, and those are included. What we were told is that there's a model, that a computer model that tries to model the impact of various plants that send effluent into Puget Sound. And that model does not include certain plants that are upstream at some level. It apparently does include Lake Stevens. It does include a couple of other plants that it discharge into rivers. So it's not a clean and simple rule, but it seems to be based not on science, not on reality, but on the computer model.
Thank you.
So Jeff, thank you for that. Question for you. So you mentioned in King County, the price would go up to $250 a month. So do we have that number for Lake Stevens, what that would look like? Are currently paying $86. What would that go up to for us?
Let me say one thing. Anybody that's sending sewage to King County right now through their district pays more than $45, because they also pay a fee to the equivalent of Lake Stevens to handle the sewage going through there. So they might be paying $70 or $80. I'm not sure. But it's a $45 component, that the wholesale portion of the price that would go up to $250. So the eventual price that a homeowner would be paying would be more than $250 in King County. But I can't address to the Lake Stevens issue. Most of us do not have a real cost estimate. Probably King County and Tacoma have done the most work with their substantial staffs on what improvements they think are needed and what they would cost. Most districts are out there, we're really not sure what we would do or what it would cost. Mariah, do you have other comments there?
Yeah, I was going to say, our third presenter is going to talk about a little bit more of what Lake Stevens' impact itself is going to be. But as far as rates go, we still don't have a full picture of what the impact is going to be or what kind of upgrades we really are going to have to do. We have a couple ideas, but we haven't chosen an approach yet to meet this standard.
One comment that I'll make in layman's terms, one of the sewage does not go through anybody's treatment plant in a hurry. It has to be worked on by the bugs, by the processes. The secret to fixing the nutrient issue typically is to have longer residence time. It takes longer through the plant in order to reduce the nutrients. But your plant, anybody's plant, has a certain capacity. And if you need to keep that stuff in there longer, you need more capacity. And that typically means expanding the footprint of your plant. And in many cases, there's just no land adjacent. In other cases, it would be expensive to do. But that's really simplistically, if a plant needs to do significant changes in order to reduce nutrients, it means expanding the footprint so that you can hold the stuff on site longer and work on it longer.
One comment I would make is that in the plant that was built, it was built with anticipation of adding additional capacity and additional basins. So one of the questions we'll come up to eventually, once we have the additional best available science that's reasonable, or however the Department of Ecology defines what the plan will be, which I assume Barry will go into a bit more detail on, is do we burn that extra real estate at the plant that we're anticipating for additional capacity to be able to take care of the nutrients and to do whatever we need to do in that? Or do we look at doing something downstream? What does that, so that we have some tools and some options once we get to that stage. We aren't completely hamstrung relative to the footprint, but it will mean trade-offs both in terms of plant footprint and future planning, as well as obviously the big question on how to pay for it. Do we redirect capital from existing capital budgets? What does that end up looking like once we have a handle on the footprint? So this is really join our pain and our angst in terms of coming around and getting educated relative to the trade-offs. And since these trade-offs will go regardless of when we come together as one entity, these will go on longer than the current even contractual horizon. And so from a Board of Commissioners, we thought it was very appropriate to bring the city in and as a whole entity, the whole council, do a level set, and then we can start working on these things in the utility committee and start doing the trade-offs. But given the time horizon on this and the level of impact, this is one of those appropriate things where we're shoulder to shoulder figuring it out and deciding how we want to do these trade-offs, because ultimately it's a combined entities issue long term.
So I understand that it's nutrients. What is the operational definition of nutrients? Is it just nitrogen?
There are the two primary nutrients that get talked about are nitrogen and phosphorus, but the Ecology is focusing almost entirely on nitrogen at this time. And I would caution that one of the concerns that we raised is that, does this mean you're going to come back at us on phosphorus after Lake Stevens has redesigned and rebuilt its plant, and then you say, oh, by the way, now we want you to look at phosphorus? And nutrients are not the only issue that is being discussed out there for Puget Sound. There are other contaminants that people are concerned about. And I think the typical wastewater treatment plant operation would like you to tell me all the problems you want me to solve before I go tearing into my expensive plant and redesigning it. We don't want to come back here in 10 or 15 years and be told, oh, by the way, there's something new. That's a very expensive way to solve Puget Sound's problems.
Yeah, I agree.
Did I fill the tape?
Jeff,
Yes.
just a quick question. You mentioned in your comments earlier that not everyone agrees on the science. Who are some of the entities and agencies that are challenging the science, and do they have any alternative thought process on it if the solution to the problem is not the nutrient?
City of Everett has a consultant named Lincoln Lohr who has been working Puget Sound issues for 20 or more years. And he does not believe that the science says what Ecology says it does. King County has a sizable staff that have been working in these issues for a long time. They also do not agree. They're working with a different model, but they're also looking at the Ecology model. The city of Tacoma has some experts that, again, a lot of experience, and they just do not agree with what Ecology says.
Okay, thank you.
This is Marcus Tagent here. I'm curious, how far is the water quality that currently is coming from the treatment plant? How far away is that from meeting the standard?
Well, it depends on the individual treatment plant. We've got some readings, and some of them are way far above what Ecology would like them to be. Others are very close. The Mukilteo plant, where I'm a commissioner, is actually well below the level that Ecology is asking for. So it's possible that our district would not have any major concerns for quite a while to come. So it's on a case-by-case basis.
Right. Yeah, I was just curious, Lake Stevens, if we knew what kind of numbers Lake Stevens, and maybe that's a question for somebody else, but.
We will get to that answer in the third presentation.
Angie, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I may have missed this. My connection's a little bit shaky. Do we have a timeline or a deadline by which these changes or upgrades need to be in place?
They've got some draft timelines. They're going to be they say they'll be issuing the final permits sometime the next few months. And there's some deadlines during 2022 that we're supposed to be doing. But we're also into a period of time where they're saying do not exceed the cap. And if you exceed the cap more than twice or something in that period, then you need to start working on a plan to upgrade your plant. So that's the plan for this first 5-year period. Then the following 5-year period for a number of plants would be very actively redesigning your plant.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Frederick, did you have a question?
I already asked my question and lowered my hand.
Saw that. I just saw that. Thanks. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, so let's go on to our next presenter, I assume. Is that right, Mariah?
Yes, please. Eileen Canola from Snohomish County will be next.
Welcome, Eileen.
Hi, good evening. I'm Eileen Canola, and I'm with Snohomish County Planning and Development Services. I'm going to be sharing my screen, so let me just adjust my computer here. Is that working? Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Or I can anyway.
All
We
righty.
can see it in, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And just wanted to express that Snohomish County is definitely very concerned about environmental issues, and because we feel that the Puget Sound is very important to, and the rivers and streams are very important to our lifestyle and our way of life in Snohomish County. We really appreciate our natural areas. However, this presentation tonight focuses on the potential impact of the ecology permit on the ability to meet our requirements under the Growth Management Act for ensuring that we have our capital facilities in place to serve the anticipated growth. So that's the focus of this, and we're not minimizing any of the environmental concerns. So I'm just going to touch on 3 main things in the presentation, and just not to cover and overlap with what Jeff presented, but just some of the concerns that the county has in terms of, again, with capital facilities planning on the proposed Ecology Puget Sound General Permit. And then just to explain our perspective on what the requirements are for capital facilities planning relative to the sewer district, sewer facilities, and sewer service providers and our state requirements. And then how that kind of blends into what we're all working on is our 20-year, is our comprehensive plan updates. So this is updating for the 20-year horizon to 2044. And we're going to be accommodating the projected growth within that 20-year planning horizon, but also to consider that, as Jeff mentioned, this new ecology permit is phase 1. You know, they're going to be having multiple permits that, as the county understands, that it's a 5-year period, just kind of like the NPDES permit. They're 5-year, and every 5 years they'll be issuing a new permit. So our concern also deals with that, is like, well, within the 20-year planning horizon for our comprehensive plan, if this is just the first permit, so there's potentially 4 more or thereabouts, depending on when they issue or reissue the permit. And what are the requirements what are the requirements for those permits on the horizon? And what does that mean for capital facilities planning within the 20-year horizon that we're accommodating the projected growth? If the requirements for each permit that comes forth, it becomes more stringent or becomes more, as Jeff mentioned, requiring massive or major updates to your capital facilities system, then that's a concern for us for sure. So again, the Puget Sound, as Jeff mentioned, it's really regarding the nutrient and focusing, like you said, on nitrogen and phosphorus. and some of the requirements are specific to, are different under this permit for different types of sewer systems, depending on how they're just discharge limits. So of course, there's the cap that Jeff mentioned. There's the planning that requires for optimization and monitoring as part of this proposed permit. And there is that permit overlay with the NPDES permit. So I think a lot of, from what we've heard and from our understanding of what the requirements of this permit is, a lot of it is on optimization and really taking down a lot of the data and taking it to a lab and monitoring it. So those alone are issues that some facilities may not have the capacity to do at this time, and also just kind of holding it, as Jeff said, too. So these are things that this permit is proposing. But if the additional permit, as Jeff mentioned, potentially is going to be targeting a different, like perhaps phosphorus, or like based on what we get and what the outcome is from this permit, maybe it'll require major upgrades, which we've already heard that that's a potential consideration. So again, this is what these are all slides from Ecology, just to give them credit. So this was their plan in formulating the permit, and this is the processes that they went through, and the modeling that they plan to do, and subsequent steps for for a second permit. I'm trying to get this little guy out of the way. So this is our concern here too, is that there's a second permit issuance, and then what the requirements are. So if we're planning in our comprehensive plan and we are going to be accommodating countywide approximately 300,000 people, and like just mentioned, based on Puget Sound Regional Council, a lot of that growth is going to the Southwest Urban Growth Area. But what does this mean for us? You know, there's 4 or 5 permits within our 20-year planning horizon. How do we know when good is good? These are our requirements. So the county is not a sewer service provider, obviously, but our role is to facilitate that and to ensure that we coordinate with sewer service providers, with cities and sewer districts, to ensure that the capital facilities, I'm going to move this, sorry, to ensure that those public facilities and services necessary to support development shall be adequate to serve the development at the time the development is available for occupancy and use without decreasing current service levels below locally established minimum standards. So this is a requirement, and it's a planning goal from the Growth Management Act. So this is what we have to work with. And as part of our annual capital improvement program, we review all of those services to ensure that they're meeting their level of service standards and there are no funding shortfalls or any requirements that are not being met. And if there is a funding shortfall or an issue, then we have to think about how to address those, whether it's lowering the level of service standard or reviewing our land use plans and land use map. So as part of the mandatory elements for comprehensive planning is a capital facilities plan element, and that consists of an inventory of existing capital facilities, a forecast of future capital facilities needs, the proposed locations and capacities, the 6-year capital financing plan, and a requirement to ensure consistency between the land use element and the capital facilities plan. And again, if it's not meeting these, then a requirement to reassess the land use element if there's a funding shortfall. And then a utilities element containing the general, similarly to the capital facilities planning. So when we're updating our capital facilities plan in light of the permit, we have to consider all these things. Like, is this the inventory? Are we going to be meeting our forecasted needs? Are we going to be needing expanded or new facilities? But if the permit will be reissued every 5 years, then is this something that is this going to be a very big concern for us in meeting our growth? So as we update our comprehensive plan, and this is what all the cities, including Lake Stevens and the county and SCT, we're all working on this right now. We're going to be working on the growth targets, but is to plan for the next 20-year population, so 20-year horizon. And then we revise our comprehensive plan and development regulations to ensure that we're complying with the requirements and we're being able to accommodate our growth. And of course, our deadline for updating our comprehensive plan is June 30th of 2024. So as Jeff mentioned, that there's a lot of growth coming to our area. The whole Puget Sound region is expected to grow by 1.8 million people. And additionally, there'll be associated jobs with that too. So as we think about regionally for the Puget Sound, how the permit affects our ability to accommodate growth, that's a concern. And if we're hearing from the city of Tacoma and from King County and Alderwood about these concerns. So that was definitely a concern from the county to ensure that we can meet our growth. And we're being directed to specific areas for high capacity transit areas for our Southwest urban growth areas, and then for our centers and our cities. So that was the regional growth, and this is more of the county growth. So the population is anticipated to increase by approximately 300,000 people between 2021 and 2024. So this is countywide. And I think this just says that 95.5% of the future population will be directed to urban growth areas. And this is our regional growth strategy here. Again, it's really hard to get these guys out of the presentation. So for Snohomish County, so we definitely will be taking on a lot of the growth, and that's kind of, this is from Psrc, by the way. So between our metropolitan cities, our core cities, high capacity transit communities, cities and towns, and urban and incorporated. And of course, many of us were in those meetings with Psrc. Rural areas are very limited to the amount of growth they're going to be taking in.
Excuse me, Eileen, could you go back to that last slide, please?
You bet.
It's important for us to know in Lake Stevens that we are under the cities and towns umbrella here on this slide. Just so that we all know where we stand on that slide. We are known by Psrc as a city or town.
So
right.
Yeah, we're still pretty big. I think we're bigger than 4 of the high capacity transit communities. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I believe David was going to speak to this, or Russ has a presentation on this as well coming up.
Yeah, this is David. We'll be talking a little bit about this later. But yeah, we're the 5th largest city in the county and rapidly approaching Edmonds and Linwood. So we are larger than a number of the other high capacity transit communities.
So again, just relative to, thank you, David, relative to the growth and where Lake Stevens stands, we're still required, we're to ensure that we're meeting our planning goal. And then just for the planning framework, the Growth Management Act provides a planning goal and the requirements for our comprehensive plan elements and the update. And then we're working with the regional growth strategy for Vision 2050. And as we all know, the countywide planning policies were just adopted by the county council. And so we'll be working on the growth targets. And then that feeds into our individual comprehensive plans and our capital facilities elements. So in our required comprehensive plan, we do have our mandatory element as our capital facilities element and utilities element, which requires the inventory. I think this should be level of service, so sorry for the typo. But I guess if there's a loss of service, it's an issue. But the capital facilities and utilities elements, these are the requirements and inventory of forecast of future growth. your needs, and then your financial planning for it. And this is where a concern comes with the permit. You know, if the financial planning is not there, if the finances to support the requirements of the permit are not there, or the future permits are so burdensome financially that it's not going to work, and we won't be able to accommodate the growth. I know that Ecology has set out an offer for, I think they had $9 million in their budget to provide assistance and funding for sewer service providers. From what I hear, that's inadequate for a lot of the facilities to meet the requirements of just this draft permit. And so for Snohomish County in particular, we're going to be proceeding with the update, but as it stands now, we have our capital facilities planning involves a general policy plan, our capital facilities plan, and then our regulations. And as part of that, we do our annual capital improvement plan, which ensures that we're meeting the targets established in our 20-year plan. And now I just want to touch on what county is doing so far on its 2024 comprehensive plan update. So we've already started. And in particular with the capital facilities and utilities elements, we'll be updating our introductory and background information. So it's consistent with the regional growth strategy, our new CPPs, and our growth targets, which are coming. We're going to be updating all the existing inventories, including sewer districts. So for water, school districts, swim, surface water, roads. So that's all going to be updated with new maps. We'll have our new forecast of future needs to 2044. I already mentioned our maps, and some level of service standards may or may not change, so will be updated. And of course, our transportation element, parks and recreation element have a big role to play, and we'll be working with them because there are major players within our capital facilities and utilities planning. And then we, the county, coordinate with you guys with our outside service providers. And something to take into consideration, and I heard a mention of this too, that sometimes when we have these permits, that if it's a funding issue regarding capital facilities, then it may mean that other areas will not receive that, because if we just have a pot of money, or if we have certain monies for capital facility upgrades, and if the sewer is consuming that, then the other infrastructure may be harmed by that. And just to underscore that there's a lot of things that, in addition to this permit, that infrastructure and capital facilities planning have to take into consideration. So just doing any upgrades regarding climate change, or considering in particular outreach for social justice and equity, and working with our tribes, and then we think about our annexations and all these other aspects that are areas of emphasis with our countywide planning policies, that these also are going to take some time and some funding and some very thoughtful consideration. So it's not just a permit, but there's other areas for capital facilities planning that we have to take into consideration, and it does come at a price in staffing. So that's always something to keep in mind, especially with climate change. And resiliency was the other one too, and hazard mitigation planning. So lots of, what were big themes this year and this coming year will be, the heat or climate changing, more intense rainfalls, and then our hazard mitigation planning. So these are also things we have to consider when we are updating our capital facilities plan and thinking about resiliency and in regards to our capital facilities and infrastructure. So this plus the permit. So again, I just wanted to emphasize this, I believe is one of my last slides. It's just that this is the 20-year planning horizon for us for our comprehensive plan update. And any of regarding this permit and a second permit being issued in 2026 and any subsequent permits and requirements from Ecology for the Puget Sound nutrient general permit. So that's a concern for us, and we just wanted to let you express this to you, and just to raise this as an issue. And We appreciate your time. Thank you so much for having me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
So is there any questions from anybody? Mr. Clark?
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation that I started working for the Snohomish County Planning Department in 1980. It's been a while. And at that time, the county population was 330,000 people, as I recall. And Eileen just said that we're expecting to see in the next 23 years another 300,000 people put on top of what the current population is. So essentially the size of the county when I started work there in 1980 is going to be added in the next 23 years and needs to be accommodated. So the numbers, I've seen those numbers before. It's still startling to me how much growth is coming our way.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right, seeing none, I think that is it Mr. Baker is next.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Baker, you've got the Zoom.
All right, thank you very much. I'm hoping everyone can hear me clearly. If not, I do have a headphone set that I can put on, but if you can hear me, I'd rather not put that on. So, all right, great. I am going to try to share my screen. Right. See screen 2. Let me see if that. All right. I'm hoping you're seeing a blue screen with Lake Stevens Sewer District wastewater treatment plant on it. Okay.
Yes.
I have 3 screens, and so I'm not always sure what you guys are seeing compared to what I'm seeing. So here we go. We will continue moving forward on that. So. So the district owns and operates a new membrane bioreactor wastewater treatment plant. We call it an MBR plant. And it also started operation in 2012 that Jeff referred to earlier of a different plant. And the treatment plant provides a very high quality effluent discharge and has since the initiation of operation for all those areas that were permitted in its individual permit, and I've already talked about that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. In fact, since starting in 2012, there has not been a single fecal coliform detected in the effluent. So extremely high quality as far as pathogens and being concerned about things like that. And as was mentioned by others before, nitrogen and nutrients were not a significant part of the permit process or the design process, although they are addressed in some ways, just not to the levels that they're looking at right now. So Ecology is writing a draft permit for the nutrients, and while this plant was not designed specifically for those things, it would not meet those requirements based on its current operation and design. Just very quickly in schematic form here, the wastewater treatment plant already has an individual permit for treatment and discharges into EB Slough. Now, EB Slough is brackish water, and so it is a mix of salt water and fresh water, which I suspect, although I don't know because I wasn't on that committee, is the reason why it was included is because it is within that estuary area of EB Slough. And it uses actually 3 different types of treatment. So there is what's called the physical treatment, or this is the gravity, having solids drop to the bottom or float to the top, and then are skimmed off the top or scraped off the bottom. And that's primarily in the primary clarifier. And then, of course, there's screens that take out those things that can be screened out. The next is biological treatment. And that is where a microbial activity occurs in various different zones. And this is really where you're going to get much of your nutrient removal if it's there. But as Jeff talked about, that's a question of storage and of time and the ability of the microbial communities to be able to actually work on those items. And so that's what we're looking at there. And then finally, there's chemical treatment that occurs before, and this is typically for disinfection or being able to handle things such as pH or other areas like that. So Nitrogen itself exists within the Earth's atmosphere, of course, and it's a colorless, tasteless, odorless gas, but it is assimilated by all living beings and all living things. So plants absorb it, people absorb it, critters absorb it. And because of that, it is part of the waste stream that comes out of domestic wastewater. In wastewater, urea is transformed into ammonia and then undergoes a process that is called nitrification, which is really when that microbial community converts the ammonia to a nitrate, then the nitrate to a nitrite. And I don't want to go into a chemistry lesson right here, but that's essentially what's happening. And those happen in areas that are known as aerobic zones or with air. And that is what you see here in the aeration basin. So we're adding a lot of air to that particular basin, and that's part of what's going on. And then it goes into another portion of that treatment plant to where there's called anoxic conditions or without air. And the nitrate is again processed by a microbial conversion, which is small bugs that are eating the nutrients that are there, and that converts it to a nitrogen gas, which simply off gases as bubbles and returns to the atmosphere. And so that is how you get it out of the system. So all of this occurs within the biological treatment portion, which is really here within the Lake Stevens wastewater treatment plant. And on our particular plant, we cycle typically the flow 4 to 5 times before it gets through that process. And that's with the tankage and the storage that we have right now. It's been talked about a little bit. Lake Stevens is, of course, considered a dominant discharger according to Ecology. And here you see a map. All those little orange squares are the dominant dischargers, and the purple dots are the ones who are not considered dominant dischargers. And so you can see this is where they're physically located. The permit is proposing 6 different areas, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because they've already been touched on by other people, but the action level, monitoring requirements, documentation requirements, and then going through these various things. But I am going to talk about how it would impact the Lake Stevens Sewer District plan itself. One of the concerns is the draft permit, as it is for Lake Stevens right now, was originally issued with 118,000 pounds per year of total inorganic nitrogen. The district has had some conversations with them about how they actually calculated that and some what we believe are errors in the methodology of calculating that. And so there's been discussions that have led to 122,000 pounds per year. Which is an easing of the limit. So the higher the poundage, the less stringent the treatment needs to be. But what you see on this is that, and actually it's a little difficult to see here. So if I blow that up a little bit, what you can see is that red line is the action level of 122,000 that's right in this area right here. And as you can see from this graph, in 2017 and in 2020, the district exceeded those requirements. And so that means that the district would not only be just needing to plan for things, they would actually need to be moving into an actual action and compliance. And so that's one of the concerns. And in fact, it appears that the district is on track to exceed it in 2021 as well. So as the permits listed right now, with having action required if you exceed in 2 of the last 5 years, the district plant is already there. The district staff and requirements that would need to be completed is new and modified testing for total ammonia, nitrates, nitrite, nitrogen, and various other components that are listed here on this table. As you can see, the columns to the left show the current frequency that's required by the district by the NPDES permit that they have now. And so in the influent, you'll notice that none of those tests are required. And in the effluent, there are tests, but it's once per month, although the total ammonia increases in the summertime because of the temperature and dissolved oxygen issues. It's more frequent. But you'll notice that those columns to the right of each one of those for the influent and effluent, that's a significant amount of increase that would be there. We estimate that that's going to be on the order of $10,000 to $12,000 of additional testing from what is present right now. And of course, the district does have a lab on site and does do a number of testing. And so it would be a significant increase to what they are having to do now. Because of documentation requirements, the annual reports could potentially be completed by district staff with references to process modeling, but more than likely there's going to be requirements for consultants to be able to assist in that. The modeling is fairly complex. And the completion of this is a significant effort by the district. And so there would need to be at least 3 engineering reports, and we show here our rough estimates. These are sort of what we call planning level estimates. We don't have formal scopes of work to be able to determine these, but an estimate of what we believe these would cost to do an optimization, which means using your existing facilities and being able to optimize what you can with what you have. And then making sure that you're doing the reporting that is required of how you're implementing that. And that's going to be a cost of about $10,000 a year. And then an actual nutrient reduction evaluation, which is going to be looking at what can you actually do to this plant as far as capital improvements to make the changes that are going to be required. Now, the current district current permit, is talking about a requirement to achieve 3 milligrams per liter on the total inorganic nitrogen. And right now, the district is just charging at about 18. So I think that answers one of the questions that was there before. And so it's a pretty substantial amount of improvement as far as the discharge. And our initial preliminary analysis is that you would not be able to make that goal with the optimization. It would have to be a completely different or new or added storage treatment train to be able to do that. And 3 milligrams per liter is a very stringent requirement as far as getting nitrogen out of the system, and would be quite significant. Let's see. So Jeff Clark's already provided a pretty good outline of the permit writing process in general and the general status. We're going to be looking at what we have here. So we would need to go through these particular aspects of the permit, and these are just simply taken from the permit that's there and written. The district has prepared a roadmap, and I think that's included in your packet for the next steps and what the management level decisions need to be made over the next several years. And it's going to be a long-term issue to meet this particular regulatory requirement that is in this draft permit. Others have talked about the potential for other permitting requirements. And if that's the case, it's going to be going through this all over again and with just a different permit requirement. So with the action level exceeded, we need to reduce effluent nitrogen load by 10%. We need to be implemented within 5 years. And then in 2025, an engineering report needs to be included to reach 3 milligrams per liter. So this is what you have to do if that action level is exceeded. And as I showed in the earlier slide, based on the limits that they have provided all in the draft permit, the district has exceeded those action levels at this time. So we have taken a preliminary look of what we could do to optimize, and that is currently there's a few things that could be done. One of them is that just as nitrogen is a limiting factor for much of the biology out in the rivers and the sound, which is the concern that's driving this whole thing, carbon is a limiting factor for that microbial community that's going, that's working in the tankage that the district currently uses in that anaerobic and anoxic and aerobic environments that are in the treatment plant. So one of the ways you can help that is you can actually add some carbon to the system that will feed those bugs that like to eat that and process that nitrogen. And there are some costs in here for that carbon addition using the existing tankage and systems that we have at the treatment plant right now. However, that is not going to meet that 3 milligrams per liter requirement. And to do that, we would need to be looking at other methods, and that would certainly be additional tankage, storage, process, and that means finding places for it on the site. Because as you noticed in the, or may have noticed in my slide about the treatment plant process, Where this needs to occur is in the biological process. So it's not in the initial physical treatment process, and it's not the end at the chemical process. It's going to be large, deep tankage. And those aeration basins are the deepest structures on the treatment plant site. So that would mean, once again, fairly significant excavation and construction, and that is a significant amount of cost. So that's the presentation that I have. I would be more than happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Mr. Clark, did you have a question?
Well, my hand was still up, but I do have a question comment, and that what we've seen in some of the districts that are essentially residential districts, their treatment plants in the last year and a half have seen significant increases in flows and in nutrient loading because people are staying home and flushing the toilet at noon instead of driving into Seattle to a job. They're working from home. And I'm wondering if Lake Stevens is seeing the same effect. And what that means long term is that the Department of Ecology is setting that maximum limit basically on pre-COVID behavior. And yet you're going to have to live with those numbers with possibly a really changed work environment.
I don't really have an answer to your question, Jeff. I think it was more of a comment, but that is true. We have not seen, well, I think the graph showed that in 2017 we had an exceedance, and then in 2020 we also had an exceedance. So it is not obvious that it is just COVID, but the fact that we are on track this year as well to exceed that limitation, certainly the last 2 years have been high years.
Any other questions for Mr. Baker? All right, seeing none, Mariah, do we have any other presentations?
Not from the district.
All right. Does the district need to close out this meeting for themselves?
One thing, Councilmember Daughtry, is can maybe just recap, for the council, what are the next immediate actions as we look out the next 6 months, let's just say, from a time horizon? What's occurring? What are we working on? I mean, our connection point clearly is the utility committee, and we'll be working with those council members and the mayor. But just kind of maybe while we have the broader audience over the next 6 months, what are some of the next steps and actions and things that are underway, just to kind of recap it before we close?
Okay.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, well, I guess you or Mariah.
Okay, I'll take a stab, Barry, and you can help me out. So we are expecting Ecology to come out with the general permit. Right now, as has been mentioned, we only have the draft version, and we anticipate some changes in between the draft and the final permit. I'm told by Ecology that it should be out before Thanksgiving, so we should see this in the next month or so. And then we are required to submit to Ecology what our first plan to help optimize is by, I believe, March of 2022. So we are already needing to start planning in order to get going by, say, January. So we also have to submit to Ecology our notice of intent to apply for this general permit that's going to be imposed on us anyways. And then every year thereafter, we need to submit to them what have we done and what kind of measures, what are our current levels in order to make sure that we are still meeting their requirements. And then, as has been mentioned, by the end of it, 2025, we need to submit the engineering plan to Ecology for how we are going to meet 3 milligrams per liter of total inorganic nitrogen.
The only thing I'd like to add to that, Mariah, is that we have a plan for what we can do for optimization, which is relatively minor capital improvements to the plant. But what it does do is this plant, like the plant that Jeff talked about in other areas, was built with a capacity greater than what it has right now and with tankage for that. So we have 3 aeration basins. We currently are using 2. We have 6 membrane basins, or excuse me, 9 membrane basins, and we're currently using 6. And so we have about a third of the tankage that we are not using necessarily. And that might be a way that we could increase that residence time and the amount of time that that microbial community has to work on the nitrogen and the nutrients. But what that does is that means that that limits how much growth would be able to be connected to the treatment plant and how much additional flow you could connect and get there. And it means that it would move up the already planned capital improvements that would be necessary to be able to handle that growth when it comes. So you might be able to do, some optimization now. You might be able to use some of that future capacity that you built for, but that's not going to take care of the problem when you get further down the road. And quite frankly, we don't know if there is enough additional capacity in the tankage that you have right now to be able to meet the requirements for the flows that you have right now. And so we need to do some more analysis and be able to figure out some things. And by we, I mean the district, on how that will be accomplished. And that's what we're working on, is to be able to try to figure those things out.
I think I'm going to point out the elephant in the room here. Is there any legislative action that we could get taken, going to the legislature and saying, hey, what the heck lives here? It just doesn't seem like this is reasonable. I mean, Mr. Clark certainly doesn't think it's reasonable. From all aspects of the discussion so far, it doesn't seem reasonable. So is there any recourse? Is there any way to bring this to light at a higher level? Obviously not higher than the legislature, but it just seems like something's running amok.
I think generally the feeling at this point is that the legislature will not step in the middle of a permitting process. It will have to come after the permit is issued. Whether there's anything that can be done at that point, there are people talking about that, but I don't have anything concrete at this time.
Well, we all know that the GMA and Department of Ecology are at opposite polar ends of the earth. And, they're basically fight each other on this for some unknown reason. But I think that that's something that maybe the city and the district could bring up with our legislators, just to at least let them know what we think is happening and get them in the know. I've never had that conversation with any of our legislators. So
it was disturbing during the advisory committee process that we had to bring up the issue that if plants have to modify themselves to meet your regulations, they may lose capacity, and that may disturb growth management projections. Ecology seemed surprised by that argument, whereas you would think that they would have thought it through in advance and know that that's a possible ramification. They're single-mindedly focused on nutrients and staying out of court with the Northwest Environmental Advocates, and they were not thinking about growth management at all.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Peter Sagan.
Just to follow along those lines, the city of Tacoma and Alderwood District filed suit against Department of Ecology. Is there not any hope of some sort of stay that would temporarily halt this implementation and kind of take a time out so that we can hopefully get some sanity here?
There's certainly hope for that. There's a feeling, I've picked up a feeling from those players that they have a very compelling case to the court. But I've seen compelling cases from my perspective not turn out so compelling to the judges. So I'm not going to bet my mortgage either way. But it's certainly possible that a court could say, no, you've screwed up. You need to go back to square one and restart this process. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any comments, questions, observations?
This is Angie. I just appreciate the information. It's a lot, and appreciate sort of knowing it now and being a part of the conversation moving forward. So thanks to all three of our presenters in the sewer district.
So let's see, Dan, Mr. Lawrenson, do you have anything else that you want to add, or do you need to close out the sewer district portion?
No, I think one just final thing that I thought it was important. I think the Board of Commissioners think it's important, and we have been working with the Utility Committee to address this, because I think this was something that's come down the pipeline within the last year that we've all had to suddenly change course and try to meet something that we did not anticipate. So we felt that this was something that, obviously, since we're partners in this community, we have to move forward on together and try to address it. I know that the statewide, as far as for we call it WASWAD, the Washington Association of Water and Sewer Districts, that we belong to, the group has been working to try to make sense of this and work with some of the legislators around the state, because it is going to affect everybody. So we appreciate you guys' time on it, and I'm sure that there'll be more to come, and we look forward to having more of these joint sessions if it will help each side move forward and save the ratepayers money in the long run. So thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting and disturbing at the same time.
Yes, it was.
Thank you for ruining my Tuesday night. No, it is important, and I think that the council, the city council, obviously could understand how important this really is. I mean, this is affecting our constituents as it is yours. So because we have the same constituents. So I thank you for bringing this up to our joint meeting. And do you have anything else, Mariah or Dan, or any of the other commissioners? Jennifer, we haven't heard from you yet.
I'm good. I think everything's been said.
Okay, Kevin, anything else for you?
Nope. Other than, it's just another one of those things that just enough money and enough time will solve. So fingers crossed.
The city's been looking for a money tree for quite a while, and we haven't found that orchard yet. So we'll continue looking. All right. Thank you to the sewer district. Thank you to the presenters. I really appreciate your time tonight and sharing this with the city council. Gives us a lot of information and something to aerate over. So thank you.
No problem. We'll go ahead and conclude our portion of the meeting as the district. So I guess I would entertain a motion from one of the other fine commissioners here.
I'd make a motion that we conclude this portion of the meeting.
I second.
It has been moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. Again, we'll look forward to seeing everybody in the future.
Thank you. Moving on into the rest of the city council workshop, we have, I believe it's David Leviton to talk about growth allocations.
President, so David Levitan, I'm going to be sharing my screen, giving a brief presentation. I figure after an hour and 10 minutes talking about nutrients and effluents, what we really need is a 28-slide PowerPoint on growth targets and buildable lands. So I'm going to go ahead and try to be relatively quick on this so I don't get too many nasty grams from Kelly during the presentation.
Did I hear you right? It is only 2.8 slides. Is that right?
2.8 slides is, I
okay,
believe,
good.
what you said.
Okay, good.
And so, well, it's that 0.8 that gets you though. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. A couple of them are title slides though, so we're pretty good. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
All right. So I am not Russ Wright, but I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the various processes and projects that Eileen from the county had talked about. We're in the middle of another number of countywide planning efforts, some that are just wrapping up and some that are continuing on. So I just wanted to touch on some of that as it relates to how we plan for growth, and then talk about some of the recent trends here in Lake Stevens. So just a little bit brief touching on city statistics. So we are now up to, with the Southeast interlocal annexation, we're up to about 7,500 acres here in the city. About 300 acres are still remaining on our UGA. Our updated population is now approaching 39,000. So as I mentioned earlier, we have Everett and Marysville, which are obviously, the largest cities in the county. Edmonds is at about 42,000, Linwood at about 41,000, and now we're approaching 39,000. So we are obviously experiencing a whole lot of growth, especially in the last couple decades. So looking at this is a map of annexations over the last 20 years. You'll see there, starting in 2002, we've gradually moved our way around the lake from the northeast around, and finally finishing up with the southeast interlocal annexation, which became effective back in August. Our population actually, as shown on the previous slide, is actually up to, when you account for the southeast interlocal annexation, is up to closer to 39,000 now. So we've increased by over 30,000 people. A lot of that obviously from annexations, but we've seen a good amount of residential development as well. So just a little bit about the growth strategy and some of the results. This is just kind of going over some of the development trends over the past 9 to 10 years. So when you look at what's been going on between 2012 and 2018, we saw about 1,000 single family homes that were built and did not see any multifamily or mixed use development. Over the course of the last couple of years, though, we've continued to see that single family residential growth, but now we've started to see multifamily projects come online, especially ones that are currently being built and are in the process of being finalized, such as Park 20, previously the Evergreen Apartments, the Park Avenue, the Lake Drive Apartments, and a number of others. So we're looking at about 400 units that are currently in the works on the multifamily or mixed use side of things. So it's starting to show that the city is changing, that we're needing to accommodate more multifamily residential development to meet our housing needs. And when you look at that number in black, that approximately 3,200 dwelling units, that accounts for everything from 2012 through in the works. So that would be including those additional about 250 units there that are listed as in the works. So the breakdown of that is about 2,450 that are single family and about 737 that are multifamily or mixed use. And if anybody has any questions, obviously the slideshow was also included in the packet, but feel free to stop me if you have any questions about the data or would like to go over anything specific. So when we look at our buildable lands, when we talk about buildable lands, this is a process that we undergo with the county that we participated in this past fall. The updated buildable lands report was just adopted by the county council, I believe, a couple of weeks ago. And so previously, when we were planning for growth in the city, when we updated our comprehensive plan back in 2015, as Eileen talked about, there's a 20-year planning horizon. So we were planning for the year 2035. And so that's what our growth targets looked at. And that's when we're talking about growth targets, we're talking about demand, projected growth. And then when we talk about buildable lands, we're talking about capacity or supply that's supported by the current zoning and the current development code that's in place at the city or at the county and other jurisdictions throughout the region. So when we look back at our 2035 growth targets and then look at what the buildable lands data that coincided with that showed, we had about just under 12,000 housing units. We were planning for a target of about 39,000. That was pre-annexation. And what we were seeing based on that was that based on the city zoning that was in place and the densities that were in place, we had a surplus of capacity over what the demand was. So we were in a pretty good spot as far as planning for residential growth. When you look at the remaining acres that are still showing within the city and within our UGA, we're kind of very rapidly running out of vacant land. So we're going to be more and more dependent on either partially used or redevelopable land. When you look down at those two numbers at the bottom, 309 acres and 304 acres. And so that's really where the city is going to need to focus a whole lot of its future growth outside of requesting and having UGA expansions approved.
So David, question for you about the partially used. Does that mean that someone's got a large lot, a home on a half acre that they tear down the home and put on triplex, fourplex, some multifamily housing? Is that what that?
Yeah, means? So that generally is kind of infill development. It doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be torn down, whether it's either single family or multifamily. It's say even if it were multifamily, but it was on a large parcel and there was the opportunity for additional units to be built. So that would be the partially used. And then just looking at our population growth, I'll just touch on this real quickly. This chart's a little bit hard to read even at this scale, but this stacked bar chart is basically showing cities and their ability to meet their 2035 growth targets and kind of when they've done that. So the purple is the growth that was attained by 2019. The blue is kind of what we consider for the purposes of the buildable lands report and for the growth targets pending. Basically, there was a date set of 2019 for the purposes of evaluating growth. Anything after that is shown in blue. And then the pink or peach is kind of more recently attained in 2020 and 2021. And so when you look at the city, just given the amount of growth that's happened just even within the last few years, a lot of that growth is focused. I'll show you on here. It's maybe hard to read. We're just about 45% when you accounted for through 2019, but we've seen a pretty big jump just over the last few years. And so that's something that we expect to continue happening. We have a number of projects that are still online. And so we anticipate, if you look at this number, we're at about 90% of our growth target for 2035 as of 2021. So we're kind of very much well on our way. And so through this process to update the growth targets to 2044, which I'll touch on briefly, we're already in a pretty good spot as far as being able to accommodate our future growth, at least on the residential side of things.
Hey, David.
David, I have a question.
Yeah.
In the buildable lands report, I know we've already passed that, but I didn't get my unmute done in time. 300 acres of buildable land remain. Is that our definition of buildable land or Department of Ecology's definition of the buildable land?
So this is a process that we undergo with Snohomish County in the lead, and so they work with all of the cities, and so they develop basically like a buildable lands model, and they look at the available lands. They look at a number of economic factors, and then they factor in the city's zoning when they're kind of estimating capacity.
And does that include the wetland variances, things like that?
It does. So they factor that in. It's kind of a GIS based, geographic information system based system where they look at a bunch of different variables. They factor in things like wetlands and assume that there's going to be a number of environmental constraints as it relates to that you're not going to be able to completely develop on a site that's largely encumbered by wetlands or by other critical areas.
Or topography.
Yeah, topography, steep slopes. So that's all factored into the model. Councilmember Jorstad.
Just for clarification, does the zoning impact whether the land is buildable? Is this just residential buildable, or is it any zoned? It doesn't matter how it's zoned.
So when you do your buildable lands report, you look at both residential and employment. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the employment as well. This is kind of the focus on the residential side of things. But similar to how we have growth targets for both housing and employment, we also need to be able to assess our capacity for commercial or employment growth so that we can reconcile that with the growth targets that are established through Vision 2050 and then filter down to the individual counties and then down to the individual cities.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. So speaking of commercial growth, you know, the city has definitely experienced a good amount. You know, since before moving back about a year and a half ago, I hadn't been to Lake Stevens in about 10 or 11 years because we had lived in Oregon for a while and I didn't really recognize it, just as far as that there was actually commercial development and a good amount of it. So this is just kind of an overview of some of the new commercial buildings. Obviously, a certain local business there at the top that's made some headlines in the past couple years, and then Vernon Village and a number of the other development that's come online in the last few years. I won't go too much into some of this, but in the works, obviously up at Silver Hill, we have a lot of interest in that. We get a lot of questions about that in the planning department, ARCO, Lee Johnson Auto, and then we're working on a couple of mixed use buildings, including one directly adjacent to City Hall at 1800 Main Street. So it's an exciting time. It's definitely kind of a changing face of the city, and as we experience kind of this new commercial growth.
Hey, David. So
Yeah.
Lee Johnson Auto, is there a location that's been identified, or is that just, I know they have one down at just off 204.
Yeah, there
Lee
is one,
Johnson.
and I hear it all the time in our planning meetings, and I haven't been involved with that project. I would need to see where I can't remember on that one, where the exact one. I'm happy to look that up for you, but I know that has been a specific proposal.
David?
Yes,
One
Councilmember
of the
Dickinson.
things- I'm sorry, did Steve get his question answered? Yes, okay. So I thank you for printing this off, Kelly, I appreciate it. If I could see some of these maps bigger, for me, the old lady with glaucoma, it would really help me to get a sense of where we're talking about buildable land that we could utilize. I get in my car, David, and drive around. That's what I do. I follow my map to get a sense of what kind of topography we're talking about. So if there's any way I could get that very map there that we're looking at here and maybe get a copy of it, it just would really help me to get a sense of what we're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, and the county has done an excellent job of putting most of their, you know, a good chunk of this is available on the county website, and they've broken it down by individual jurisdictions. So I'd be happy to send that to you, and you can kind of zoom in as you want on the PDF version. And so they've broken that out for individual cities, including their UGAs. And so it's pretty easy to take a look at, you know, zoom into the parcel level.
Thank you. That'll help.
All right, so looking at the buildable lands, speaking of buildable lands, when it comes to employment, so right now the city has an estimated 5,500 jobs. And the target as far as for 2035, that's the current one that's been adopted since 2044 targets have yet to be, is about 7,400. And so there's kind of remaining capacity for about 1,900, and there's actually that should be, yeah. So I think, yeah, we have the kind of flip, but the remaining capacity of about 1,900, and what that projects when you try to reconcile the supply and the demand is about a deficit of about 105 jobs over the 2035 planning horizon. You know, when you look at the remaining acres that are available, again, not a whole lot on the vacant side, you know, about 41 acres, almost all of that within the city proper, and not a whole lot partially used or pending. Really, it's going to rely on redevelopment of existing, you know, not severely underutilized properties. So basically industrial properties. You know, when you look at this map and you look where the purple shows up, it's really in our industrial area, which obviously we're going to be putting a major focus on over the next year, as far as doing an infrastructure analysis to try to increase our employment capacity in that area. And then down on the south side of 20th, within the 20th Street sub area, So those are really the two major areas that are identified as having capacity for growth, and that employment target is going to be rising. We're still finalizing the 2044 target, and we'll show, I think maybe one of the last slides shows the preliminary numbers. We're continuing to have conversations with the county. We're going to be having a specific conversation with the other cities and towns, the other basically smaller cities that are within the same category as Lake Stevens. We're going to be talking to them in advance of the potential adoption of the growth targets before it gets forwarded on to the steering committee and then on to the county council. So we're kind of right in the swing of talking about, you know, what the distribution for employment growth targets are going to be. There's been some discussion about trying to factor in some additional transportation analysis and how that impacts employment growth, how to incorporate things such as high capacity transit. So we're still in the process of updating those numbers, and we'll be able to come back to you as we go through that process and give you an update on that.
David, I have a question for you regarding 20th Avenue and the Everett water line and so forth. If we were to take out, I'm looking at some purple and dark blue here, where you have essentially 25 to 500 employees capacity identified. If for whatever reason that area stays stagnant due to the water line situation, what's the total number that we could be in deficit for employment?
I would have to look at that as far as, I mean, when you look at the one that's kind of more in the violet color, so it's within 100 to 500, and then kind of that's between 79th and 83rd, and then there's one that's kind of east of 91st. I'd have to see what the individual, but I would have to say that's at least probably 300 or 400 jobs. And so this does factor in the, that was one of the layers that's included within the GIS analysis, is that easement. So you can kind of see that it shows it as white as you're right up against 20th. So it kind of accounts for that easement, that it's not occurring on those parcels. It's as you get a little bit further south.
Yeah, and I understand the corridor, but I guess coming from the standpoint of what, say the parcel that sits north of Cavallero mid-high, if for some reason developers simply don't want to deal with the city of Everett and that property sits because of the inability to access the property in a true utility of that property.
Yeah, that's something that obviously we'll need to focus on, and that was something that we've kind of mentioned that this area maybe has not redeveloped as quickly as we had previously anticipated, and there definitely are some constraints, including the water easement, that make it maybe difficult to develop. And we kind of referenced that in some of our UGA expansion applications that will be formally considered by the county council at a later date. And so I think we should probably do some additional analysis as part of this, and especially as we get into the comprehensive plan update. That's something that I think we definitely can. And as we look into some of the kind of elements that have been discussed tonight, capital facilities, utilities, there's definitely some opportunities to look at how that impacts our employment capacity and how that's going to influence our ability to meet our employment growth targets over the next 20 years.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd be curious to see that information. I think there's substantial obstacles there. Gosh sakes, when I was back on the planning commission years ago, we were talking about this and, developing the corridor and so forth. And with the exception of Costco, it really hasn't happened. So, I would, from my standpoint, I would see probably continued obstacles to have that corridor develop out, and I think that only aids in our discussion for some sort of relief on the urban boundary somehow. So I'd love to see those numbers.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm happy to kind of get into that, and I can provide that to you. So,
all right, great, thank you.
All right. So moving along, this is, I'm sure, incredibly hard to read, especially on a small screen, but the city has attained about 45% of its 2035 growth targets over the last 6 years. So, you know, we're kind of in the middle of the pack when you look at that. Some of these cities, obviously, like Breyer, didn't have a whole lot, and if you get one large employer, they have very much exceeded that. But we created about 1,568 jobs between 2012 and 2019. So that definitely was a pretty large jump, and we're kind of focusing over the next year on the Machias, the Lake Stevens industrial area, the former Machias and Hartford industrial areas combined. So that's going to be a focus. And then I think we definitely need to take a closer look at 20th Street. And then also the other designated sub areas being Lake Stevens Center and downtown, and what their role is in helping us achieve our employment capacity and our employment growth. So a lot of this stuff was touched on earlier as far as kind of the role of Vision 2050. So obviously Vision 2050 was adopted last October. There were the multi-county planning policies, the metropolitan planning policies that then filtered down into the countywide planning policies that were adopted also back last month by the county council. So this is kind of just showing what the expected population growth of about 1.75 or 1.8 million people, how that's going to be distributed. Snohomish County would get about a quarter of that, with about half of it going to King County, while we're getting about a quarter of the population growth. Only about 20%, about 19% of the job growth has been assigned. So there still is definitely the employment growth continues to be oriented towards King County more than Snohomish County as far as, a balance between employment and housing. So these are just going to touch really briefly on these, but just some of the MPPs or multi-county planning policies. There was kind of a major emphasis on climate change and equity, and then really kind of high capacity transit that's integral to the growth concept for Vision 2050. It was for Vision 2040 as well. And so there is the expectation that a majority of the residential growth is going to occur along high capacity transit corridors and within the metropolitan cities and other core cities. So that's something that obviously Lake Stevens is outside of those planning designations, but we are anticipated to accommodate the largest share of growth, with us being the largest city in that cities and towns designation. And so that's something that we'll need to plan for, and how that impacts future growth in Lake Stevens.
Hey, David, with us not being designated as a high capacity, transit priority, how does that impact, being able to get Highway 9 and the trestle taken care of? I mean, because those are major transportation corridors there that affect Lake Stevens and surrounding communities, but with us being considered basically a outlier from those areas, even though we're bigger than many of the ones that are getting the designation, that seems like the money would flow to those ones that are designated high capacity versus us, where we're kind of left for the scraps.
I think as far, I would defer to Russ, and he's much more knowledgeable about this as far as how that funding occurs than I am. I think on the transit side of things, that seems to be the case. I think as far as some of the funding that, obviously the city has applied for through our local legislators and our statewide legislators, there still is an opportunity on the vehicular side of things to be pursuing that, and opportunities for transit as well. We are trying to get, kind of a regional growth center designation for Lake Stevens Center. And so that's something that we're going to continue to pursue, and we think that it's warranted based on the characteristics and the changing characteristics and the increasing employment. And I think if we continue to see infill residential development and more mixed use, I think it would strengthen the argument for that. So it's still kind of an evolving issue and something that is very much on our radar.
As far as the transit on Highway 9, specifically speaking of community transit, obviously, the difficulty with that, of course, is one lane. That's something that we've been working on for years to try to get fixed. The entire Highway 9 corridor has been under a planning document for quite a while to extend 2 lanes all the way north. But the other thing on the transit side of it with CT, they're already looking at putting in a quote unquote commuter line, which would basically stop in Lake Stevens, pick up people, and then make no other stops all the way to the Cascade industrial area. Seeing how Granite Falls, Snohomish, Lake Stevens, parts of Marysville up in our area are basically the housing for those in that industrial area. And so that is being looked at by community transit right now. It would not be a bus rapid transit line, but a commuter line such as the 800 series that goes now to North Lake Light Rail Link, or the 500 series, which goes directly downtown. But those are the kinds of things that community transit looks at in accordance with the 2050 plan. So.
Yeah, and I think just given the anticipated employment growth there up at the Cascades and the Arlington, Marysville area, we're going to continue to look at that, and kind of within Snohomish County specifically need to continue to have discussions about how that's potentially going to impact not just residential development, but commute patterns and the opportunities for transit growth to serve those areas. So those are all discussions that we continue to have within between cities and with the county as our partners. So this slide right here is just talking about the regional geographies based on the regional growth strategies. With you'll see that the only metropolitan city in Snohomish County is Everett, and then there are the core cities of Linwood and the Snohomish County portion of Bothell, and then there are a number of high capacity transit communities, and then you see us up here, kind of very much by far the largest of the cities and towns, and that's both geography and population. Us at about 39,000, and then I think the next largest city is Monroe at about 22,000. So this is just kind of illustrating where the majority of the anticipated growth is expected to occur, both by the designations and also by county. So obviously a big chunk of that, especially for metropolitan cities, being Seattle and Bellevue, is there in that red. There's the core cities and the high capacity, and then we would be in this one as far as cities and towns, and we would be a part of this green. So when you look at the anticipated growth, it's obviously not a huge component of it. I'm not quite sure why this slide didn't show properly, but the same is true for, yeah, it's not letting me fit the whole thing. I'm not quite sure why, but the same is true for employment. It's so small you can't even see it on the screen. So, but basically the expectation is that, the major components of growth are going to happen within the metropolitan cities, the core cities, and the high capacity transit communities. So when we're looking at the regional growth strategy, specifically as it relates to Snohomish County, this is just pointing out some of the employment centers specifically. So you have Cascade within Everett, you have Painfield and Boeing, you have kind of Linwood, and that these are designated regional growth centers and high capacity transit station areas, and that they're expected to support compact growth. And so about 65% of the residential growth and about 75% of the employment growth is anticipated to be in these areas. And this is something that we continue to discuss. There have been some, when you look at the 2035 growth targets, some of these cities have had some difficulties just because they were allocated so much growth in the past. They haven't been able to keep up, and they don't seem on track to meet their growth targets. And so we are planning within the regional growth strategy. And so that then is delegated down to the counties and then to the individual cities. And so we are planning within that framework, and that is a point of some discussion just as far as how do we kind of ground through some of this information and account for some of the discrepancies or some of the inabilities to meet growth, and how should we be dealing and planning for that, especially leading into the 2024 update. For the purposes of Lake Stevens, we do show a little bit of a deficit on the employment side. So we're going to need to be looking at policies related to employment, commercial and industrial areas. On the residential side, we generally continue to show a surplus based off the draft growth targets. So that's something that as we get into the 2024 periodic update, which is required to be adopted by June 30th of 2024, those are definitely going to be areas of focus. We're in the process of applying for a housing action plan grant from the Department of Commerce, which would then provide us really with the technical analysis and give us a really good assessment of what's on the ground and what the city's current and future housing needs are. So that's something that we're going to be applying for on Thursday. And so that, hopefully will provide us with a good amount of information to really look at our housing element to see what we need to be updating to accommodate future growth that actually is consistent with the needs and the demographics across housing types, across incomes, to make sure that we meet both the housing needs and the employment needs of all segments of the Lake Stevens community. So this is a little bit of repetition just at the local level. So core cities of Bothell and Linwood. There are a number of the urban growth areas within these cities that are either adjacent to 405 or adjacent or 525 or I-5 that are designated as high capacity transit communities, or that are along Highway 99. And so they, even if they're a little bit smaller than Lake Stevens, just given their geography, that's what leads into their designations. And then we are by far the largest of the cities and towns. So this was a slide that you already saw tonight, but it's, and as Mr. Clark pointed out, we're anticipated to grow the county at the county level by about 300,000 people, which is what the population was excuse me, back in 1980. And so 95.5% of that is directed towards the urban growth areas, as you would expect that the majority of growth, the vast majority of growth is going to happen within the UGA. And these are a number of slides that come directly from the county, and that's why they may look familiar. When you look at, so this is where we're reconciling the supply, which is the buildable lands report, with or the capacity, which is the buildable lands being supply, versus the growth, which is the demand. And so when you look at some of these, especially as you compare the 2035 growth targets to the 2044, when you look at the cities and towns, which is what City of Lake Stevens is, it's actually a net surplus when you compare 2044 to 2035. But when you look especially at the high capacity transit communities and the metro city, being Everett, there's kind of expanding the gap as far as the deficit. So that's something that's definitely going to need to be planned for within those communities based on these preliminary growth targets that are being discussed. So that's going to, as part of their 2024 periodic updates, they're going to need to try to address that through their comprehensive plans. And this just talks a little bit about both pre and post 2017 annual growth. Again, within Everett, the expectation and what we've seen recently is that they've had an increase in the annual population change compared to pre-2017. So they're kind of on the right track as far as on the residential growth side of things. Starting to see a little bit of a decrease in the high capacity transit communities, and it's been about a 10 to 15% increase over the last 3 to 4 years in the cities and towns, which Lake Stevens is a part of. So this is aggregated at the county at the countywide level for each individual designation. Similarly, when you look at the delta between the 2044 growth targets and 2035, when you're trying to reconcile supply versus demand, you see here again, there is, except for the urban unincorporated areas, there is a net deficit. Basically, that's they're you know, preliminarily there appears that there's going to need to be some policy and program changes through the various comprehensive plan updates to account for the need to increase employment capacity to meet projected growth. So that's kind of what these kind of gray bars show. You see there in the metro cities, that's a pretty big number. It's obviously an increase of over 50% as far as the increase in the deficit. And so that's something that will need to be accounted for. And then this is kind of the employment change of kind of a similar graphic of pre-2017 and post-2017. So the good thing when you look at the metro cities is that the growth is kind of accelerated in recent years, where similarly to how the residential growth has kind of slowed down a bit in the high capacity transit communities, it's also the annual employment change has also gone down to correspond with the decrease in the residential growth that's occurred over the last few years. And these are a lot of graphs, and so I'm not going to go into these too much. These are breaking out just those metro cities, the high capacity transit communities, but basically shows, you know, you want to see the population, you know, basically when you look at Everett, you know, at least from a trend perspective, it's showing that as you look into the future, it's going to need to kind of grow at, you know, a quicker rate. And so I don't want to get too much into these. These are just some good slides that have been prepared by the county. We're happy to provide some additional context on this, but it basically breaks down. The orange is population and the blue is population capacity based on the 2021 BLR and the 2035 growth target. So these will shift a little bit as we finalize the 2044 growth target. So I don't want to get into the specific numbers too much because they may shift a little bit, but it basically just shows some of the trends that are anticipated over the next 20 years. And we have a couple tables here at the end that basically just show or just highlighting some tables. These were kind of more for background information for the packet. So they're basically just highlighting Lake Stevens' position within the cities and towns, what the anticipated current population is, employment estimate, and then kind of as we get into, this is specific to Lake Stevens, is kind of corresponding to those series of graphs that were shown on a couple slides before, the projected employment and then the employment capacity. And so when you look, when the orange is above the blue, obviously you're going to result in a net deficit, and you're going to need to potentially require some additional policies or look at some ways to increase your employment capacity to keep up with projected growth going out to 2044. So that's going to be an integral component of the comprehensive plan update. And that's why we really need to look at some of our potential employment areas, industrial areas, 20th Street and others, to really help us to reconcile the demand and the supply. And I'm not going to go into this too much, and these are kind of similar on the population side. Again, basically we're showing the blue is the population capacity based on the buildable lands report, and so we're still showing a net surplus when the orange is below the blue. So we're in a pretty good position as far as not needing to have a lot of wholesale changes in our comprehensive plan and in implementing ordinances as it relates to needing to specifically increase overall capacity. What we do want to focus on as part of our housing action plan and as part of our housing element as part of the comp plan is making sure that we have an accurate assessment of the actual needs of, across a variety of different income levels, housing tenures of ownership versus rental, to make sure that we're looking at the specific components of our housing market and not just at the sheer number of units. It's just as important to make sure that we are providing for the needs of the Lake Stevens community as opposed to just the overall numbers, even if we do have a net surplus.
Hey, David, quick question for you here on that slide on 158.
Yeah.
So it looks like, as I said, we had a population average of 770 increase per year. But I'm looking at other cities around that are not meeting their growth targets. And, if I had the choice of living in Everett or Lake Stevens, I'd live in Lake Stevens, better schools and just a better city overall. And also looking at Mukilteo is getting ready to ban multi-housing at this election, or an advisory vote that could potentially look at doing that, which again could push people here to Lake Stevens. So I'm curious why we think that only 367, so half of what we have been experiencing over the last 10 years, why we think that's the case, because I would think that the demand would go up based on the livability of the city and other cities not meeting their targets and then restricting housing within their cities.
Yeah, and I would have to kind of reach out to the lead county staff on that. These are issues that we've been discussing. When you look at some of the cities that have outperformed their kind of growth targets and kind of very much already achieved them, within the first 6 years of the planning horizon. A lot of this comes from obviously the regional growth concept. It filters down to the county. It's then broken out into these individual cities and towns versus HCT versus core cities. And there's not a whole lot of flexibility to kind of be trading essentially future growth across the designations, as far as, saying that Everett is not going to accommodate. We don't anticipate that Everett's going to be able to accommodate the projected growth. And so that should be shifted to the Lake Stevens or Monroe's of the world. It's a little bit more difficult, and there's a little bit more involved with that. There is some opportunities within the cities and towns to kind of move around some of those numbers. And on the employment side of things, those are some discussions that we've had. And there are some opportunities to have that. If the city council is in a position where they feel that we should be trying to accommodate more of the regional growth, that's something, that would be a policy decision from the council that we could then take back to these various committees and say that Lake Stevens is in a position and we feel like we should be planning for more growth. But that's something that we would need to have with our various city and then our county partner when we're talking about that.
I'm not suggesting that we want to do that. I'm just suggesting that that's a likely outcome just based on supply and demand.
Yeah, and as we get into, it's not just planning for employment and for residential, as our speakers earlier spoke about, and specifically Eileen at Snohomish County PDS, is when you're planning for capital facilities, obviously you want to have, as accurate of growth targets as possible. And so we want to be confident in those numbers. And it has been, it's been a good process, and we've had a number of meetings with county staff and with the various cities. And we're going to continue to have those as we get towards the potential county council adoption of those growth targets. And, especially on the employment side of things, potential discussions about our ability to accommodate future employment growth, other communities' ability, whether some of those deficits that are projected, is there an ability, is there an opportunity to adopt reasonable measures within existing UGAs or city boundaries through, new comp plan policies, new development regulations, or is there a need to potentially look at a UGA expansion? So those are all things that are still being discussed and in the works. And this is, you thought that the previous discussion was, super simple. This is, even easier. So we have our hands full, but it's been a good process so far, and we look forward to carrying it forward into the 2024 update. And so these are just a couple last few slides that just show some of the projected employment growth allocations. And so this kind of just shows the delta. When you look at the far right column, there's the employment change between 2019 and 2044. So that's about 3,219 jobs. The preliminary 2044 growth target being about 8,900, and the city currently having about 5,700 jobs. So about 3,200 jobs that would need to be accommodated between 2019 and 2044. And this is the equivalent of population allocations. If you look at the far right column, we highlight both the city proper. You'll see that this column accounts for the Southeast Interlocal Annexation, basically just shifted numbers from the UGA up into the city, which resulted in the new population of about 39,000, but projected growth of about 8,900 people by 2044. And then not a whole lot of capacity left within the UGA. So just a population change of about 315 people within the UGA. And so these just this is the last slide, just looking at the population estimates and the employment estimates of 2021, and then what the growth targets are for 2044. These are still have not been finalized, but when you look at the reconciled population target of about almost 48,000, so it's about an additional 9,000 people. That's based on the current boundaries, the most recent boundaries, and then the job target being about, I think Russ may have updated. These numbers have been shifting a little bit, so this 8651 is a little bit different than the number that was in the table on the previous slide. So these are still kind of in the works, but essentially about 3,200 to 3,300 jobs that would need to be created by 2044. And with that very short presentation, I'm happy to answer any questions.
David.
All right, so we just got a little bit of information from David. Anybody have any questions?
Yes, Councilmember Daughtry, I have a question, kind of a what if. You know, you showed the numbers as being 700 and something of what we grow in the last 10 years. Projection for the next annual growth is 300 and something. What if we grow faster than what we have the last 10 years? I guess what is our out for planning as far as exceeding numbers? I guess the difficulty I have with these population allocations is, for instance, the city of Everett has never met its population allocation in the 20-some years of growth management. So we've been taking that population. And so I guess, what is the changed circumstance that is going to entice people to populate the city of Everett? And so assuming that doesn't happen and we grow faster than what we have grown, what is the mechanism to address that?
Yeah, so I think when we look at our capital facilities and our public services and our utilities elements, I'd have to do a little bit more research. I think we need to plan in coordination with the Growth Management Act and with Vision 2050 and the countywide planning policies. I'm not sure would be anything that would preclude us from maybe looking at a higher growth alternative as far as potentially adopting goals or policies or strategies related to some potential flexibility in that. I would have to discuss that with Russ, but I've seen that in some other jurisdictions that maybe thought that they were going to achieve a little bit faster growth than what had been allocated to them. I think generally on the utility side of things, on sewer, on water. My understanding is that we would be in a decent position if we were to continue to experience growth beyond what was anticipated. A lot of the providers are more regional in nature. And so, you know, if some of this growth shifts around from Everett to Lake Stevens, or Snohomish to Lake Stevens, or Lake Stevens out to Index, I think there is some opportunities to still meet some of the utility demands from utility providers. And so that's something that we can look at. If that's a concern that's expressed by council, we can look at ways to address that as part of the comp plan update. And that's something that with the sewer district currently working on their comprehensive plan, and obviously the county working on theirs, you know, there's opportunities to address some of these concerns.
Any other questions, council?
Just wow. Just got to say, there's a lot of information. I'm very encouraged. What would encourage me is if we got more jobs in Lake Stevens. That would be a real plus. So whatever we do to make that happen, it would be a plus for all of us. Thank you so much for this presentation, David. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Sean, did you have a question?
I was just going to thank David for a very thorough presentation and all the information. It's certainly a lot to digest. And I'd also like to take a moment. I think Councilmember Psrc kind of asked the central important question for all of us to consider, which is the what if. You know, projections change annually, much less projections that go several decades out into the future. And we really need to at least consider some contingencies and know what our options are so that we can plan accordingly if we start to see these numbers move in a way that isn't consistent with these plans. And frankly, given what our inventories are for available space, primarily through redevelopment, we probably need to look down those roads anyway. So a lot to process.
Yeah, and we do, obviously this isn't, you know, it's a 20-year growth targets, you know, that would be effective from the adoption date of the comprehensive plan, but it you know, it's updated obviously more frequently than every 20 years. So there is an opportunity to try to remedy this in the next round of buildable lands report and growth target allocations. But, you know, if we were to see significant deviations, you know, we obviously would need to assess and address that. And, you know, we've obviously been growing more rapidly, I think, than was anticipated when the 2035 growth targets were estimated, and we've still generally been able to accommodate that growth. Obviously, there are some growing pains and there's some potential, especially short-term impacts on infrastructure as we, you know, build out the transportation infrastructure and do needed improvements. But that can be, you know, factored in as far as at the local level and through some of the programs that we have and some of the funding mechanisms. So that's something that when we look at that, that's something we can take into account.
Well, I think it goes without saying that there's also a problem of some of our services that we have to supply to our citizens, such as our parks and play fields and things like that, that we are in dire need of right now. And, you know, we only have so many acres left to do anything with those. That acreage also includes those kinds of things, not to mention the fact that the school district needs more land to be able to build out some of their system. And, you know, so it seems to me like if you took into account just those types of things, we could use every bit of land that's left just for those. And, you know, that doesn't look very good either. I don't see, if we continue to build housing on some of this buildable property, how are we ever going to meet the needs of the citizens that are here in the area of recreation or schools or, you know, transportation, any of those things. So that I'm kind of worried about that.
Yeah, that's definitely something. I mean, with the district, you know, we adopt their capital facilities plan by reference. They are required to update that on a pretty regular basis. So they need to look at that, and they factor in a lot of the same data that we look at as far as population growth. When it comes to parks, when we get into the parks and recreation element, you know, we've been, as typically happens between periodic updates, we haven't been doing a whole lot of changes during the annual comprehensive plan dockets. But as we get into the 2024 update, that's definitely something that we're going to want to account for, especially as the city gets into, you know, the recent discussions of having, you know, a fully established parks department and wanting to provide, you know, a higher level of service as far as parks and recreation facilities that you know, are warranted for a city of our size now, that we're not the city that we were even in 2015, and especially not in 2006. And so yeah, a lot of things to think about.
It's certainly a balancing act, and it's up to us to help decide how we're going to balance it. Any other questions for David? Okay, we've already been at this for 2 hours. Is there anything else for the good of the order? If not, then we are done with this particular workshop. Thank you very much for your attentiveness, Council. Kelly, you have something to say?
I do. Thank you. Just real quick, don't log off. We are working really hard to have an in-person council meeting next week in the mill, and we're going to do a hybrid situation with Zoom. If you want to be on Zoom, take public comment by Zoom or in person. But Caitlin, the new deputy city clerk, sent you guys an email today asking if you're comfortable coming in person so that we can space out the room accordingly. So please reply back to that so we can get a head count, and we're gonna give this a try on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you. I did see that email. I answered Caitlin. Get everybody else to answer her also.
Great, thank you.
I can't wait to get down there. Anything else? Gene, did you have anything?
I do not. Thank you, though. Good meeting.
All right, we'll see you.